Greetings and welcome to this discussion on the forgotten crops of Meghalaya. Now, what do we mean when we say forgotten crops? Simply this: they are crops that have been cultivated and consumed for centuries, even millennia. But over the last 50 years or so, we have forgotten about them. They have gone off our diets and off our plates. Now, these crops were used for their food, for fiber, for oil, even for their medicinal properties. But why have we forgotten them? And why is it so important that we bring them back and remember them? Now, that is what I have. That is what I have two panelists here with me on this discussion. So first and foremost, let me introduce you to our first panelist. That is Dr. Melari Nongrum. She is an associate professor with the Indian Institute of Public Health. And welcome to the discussion, Kong Melari.
Yeah.
Looking forward to your views. And secondly, we have someone who's done a lot of work on the field. That is Kong Jakhria, who is the lead associate agroecology with the Northeast Slow Food and Agrobiodiversity Society. That's a mouthful. In short, it's called NESFAS. So welcome, Jakhria, to the discussion. So let me start right away. First and foremost, we've talked about these forgotten crops. I believe you have a problem with the term forgotten crops. So correct me right away.
Okay, thank you, Vama, for having us today. To start with, the very term forgotten gives us an idea that we have not used them. But then if we look at our indigenous community, it seems to be misplaced in terms, because if we look at the diversity in our indigenous food system, our people are still using it in this plate. But what we see is that it might have been used at a lesser frequency or so. But then what we are seeing is that the forgotten word, in a sense, is because it has been forgotten by the scientific community or by the government into looking into the diversity that is there existing in our food system.
But we can agree that they have disappeared from our plates, more or less.
I wouldn't say so, because if you look at the community still so, our food system is based on the diversity of a production system. Now, each of the production system is built on the diversity of crops being cultivated. Like, unlike the monocropping that we see elsewhere, right, our food system, even if you go into the kitchen garden, we have families that grow more than say 30 to 50 species. And also our food system is also known for the collection from the wild. That is inclusive of the wild edibles that is still very much part of our food diet. Yeah.
We'll come to that. But we have talked about these crops, these underutilized or forgotten crops. Why don't you name them a few, so people might be confused? What are we talking about?
I think, as I just mentioned, the most important among them would be the wild edibles, which we know are very micronutrient dense. Like I would name them in Khasi, like Jamardo, Jatira. Those are some of the wild edibles that are still used in the community, but it's known to be very highly nutrition rich. And the thing about these wild edibles is that they have been part of the sustenance of the community, especially in the lean months. And the others would include saw plum, which is a very common crop here, but the world doesn't know about it. And maybe Kong Melari can add on into the benefits of these. Then we were just talking with Kong Melari on some of the non-grain staples, like the tubers, the yam, which used to be known as the famine crops. But now, because of the introduction of maybe rice or so, we have forgotten them. Then we have rosella is among the crops. Millet is one. So these are some of the examples that we see from the
field. So there we reeled out a few names, some of them in Khasi. So at some point of time, you can Google the English names of these ones. But Kong Melari, let's bring you in here. First and foremost, like Jakhria there has mentioned how they add to our nutrition. So there's a great nutritional value for these crops. Talk to us about it. Why of the nutritional value that these crops bring?
Yes. So as Jakhria has mentioned, right, the wild edibles, especially the green wild edibles, have been found to be very nutritious. In fact, nutritive studies have been done by several institutions, and we found that they are, they have higher nutritive value, or comparable to even market foods. I'll just give a few examples. For example, when you look at Centella asiatica, the Klangsiar, which is very common. So that has a very high iron, as well as even Jamardo, the Hotunia cordata, is also high in vitamin K as compared to the palak or the lettuce that we find very commonly sold in the market. So these, and also like from the tubers point of view, for example, we have the orange sweet potato, which actually has maybe we don't see it in the market so much, right? But we still have communities who are still cultivating it. So that also, they have a lot of beta carotene. So these wild edibles have very high nutritive content. I would just like to state, there was a study that was conducted. I was not involved in that. There was another scientist who was conducted it in Ribhoi district, among 13 villages. And what they find in that study was very interesting. They were doing it among pregnant and lactating, non-lactating mothers, basically among women. And they found that in terms of calcium, iron, and the beta carotene, these wild edibles, just the green wild edibles, could actually meet at least 23 to 40% of the needs of a woman. If they, of course, if you have to have it in adequate proportions. So what we say is that, in terms of even calcium, sometimes we say that, we don't take milk, let's say as a Khasi community, we don't really take milk. Even milk tea is rarely taken, especially in the rural areas. So, but then, we have sources of calcium like this, which I believe has actually sustained our community for, generations and generations altogether.
That's a very interesting point that you raised there, of these crops having sustained our community over generations. But there also is this very distinct loss in plant diversity that we are facing now.
Yes.
So when we talk about these forgotten crops or underutilized crops, and then going off our diets, which you say not totally, but there is a distinct lack of plant diversity, isn't there, in Meghalaya? Can you give us a sense of what we've lost over these years? Risha, with you first. How much we've lost?
It would be hard to say because there hasn't been much study being done on what has been lost. All right. But what is to be seen is that because of the changing diets, especially if we look at the urban communities, we rarely see the inclusion of the local food plants. And also this is slowly going into the rural areas as well. But thankfully, we do have communities who are known for the rich wisdoms, the elders who are still propagating the knowledge of, the food plants that is around there. And this is how we have to strengthen the intergenerational transfer of knowledge between the communities, and then in a way promote for the conservation at the community level. But is this the lack of knowledge? That is one of the causes that would say is the supplemented to the loss of the foods.
So it's clear that there is a very clear urban and rural divide when it comes to these crops. It's like in some rural communities, these are still being consumed, still very much part of our diet, but it's gone off the urban palate, if you like, of how. So let's give a sense to the city slickers, like we all are, of how much they've lost, or what they can gain. Like you mentioned of the calcium content for lactating in pregnant mothers, for example, from some of these from some of these crops. What are the other benefits for some of our city dwellers that they could get from these crops, of incorporating these crops into their diets again?
Yeah, I would say that, most of our, we can say, I would prefer to use the word traditional food, right? Most of our traditional food, which has been, which is growing in our, in our communities, is basically very low input in terms of fertilizers and pesticides, right? So I think as city dwellers, we go for organic. We are aware of, the benefits of organic food and how low, pesticide or fertilizer use is beneficial for our health. So even from that point of view, traditional food is mainly grown with very, with almost no pesticides or fertilizers, especially if it comes from a jhum field and things like that. So basically, we are eating organic food, if we can say, right? Or so that is one benefit. The other benefits I could say is that, of course, the nutritive value, which I've already mentioned. So that's very high. So we could actually, include that, and it'll be beneficial for our health. But then I think as city dwellers, we should also recognize that when we consume traditional food, it also has multiple repercussions. And the multiple repercussions is to the farmer themselves, because then there's a market for that farmer to grow. There's an incentive because there's a market. So we are creating a market for our own farmers, you're right? So that is one. The other one is when we talk about, we say eat local, so we're reducing the carbon footprint also, because we are not bringing food from outside, and, transportation and all of that, but we're just bringing it probably just about, 24 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 50 kilometers. So that way we are actually boosting even the economy of our farmers if we are actually eating traditional food.
I was going to come to that next. So the importance of bringing in local farmers into and the role they play in this economy of these traditional crops. Now you've done a lot of work in the field. NESFAS has, and I'm sure you were leading it. Give us a sense of how much of how much the incorporation of traditional crops into the local economy, what that can mean to the farmers. I mean, Komilari has touched upon it a bit, but you've been on the field. Maybe from field level, you could give us some examples of that.
So just adding on to that, when we talked about our food system, we try to, just like Komilari have said, we're trying to shorten the supply chain. And I think we're looking at a way of making our food system into a circular economy. So an example I would like to state of how we are building in is, it looks into the aspect of production, consumption, and livelihood. So if we talk about circular economy, these all aspects have to be circularity between these three components. Now, if we talk about, say, I'll start with consumption. Like we, through NESFAS, we talk about the 10 food groups that has been put in by FAO, and we say that for you to have a dietary diversity of a minimum of 5 has to be consumed in a day. So we saw that out of the 10 food groups, 7 of them are plant-based. So that gives us an impetus to say that we do have a rich diversity in our food system, local food crops, and that 7 food plants can be supplemented by these 7 food plants that we have. The second thing, what we're doing from our work is in terms of knowledge that we say. So how we're doing is by linking it through the school gardens, because we say the next generation is the one who's going to be taking out the work. So we have the school gardens. And the other aspect of the economy, it would say, for example, the Meram O cafes. I think it's quite known of the work that we have done, or which is called the Mother Earth Cafe. So unlike the usual cafes that we just go and sit in there and just have this thing, but it gives you an experiential learning as well of what other edible food that is there. So if you look at the Meramo Cafe as one of the points, that is a point where you also are bringing in the wild edibles awareness in terms of, because the promotion that we're doing through NESFAS is trying to bring in urban dwellers as well. So that gives them an idea of what the food plants are available in the food system. But at the same time, the Meramo Cafe, who is making those preparations, are sourcing it from the farmers. So in a way, it's like helping the entire community to jointly grow together in terms of the aspect of strengthening the food system.
Okay. So as you've heard, these traditional crops or forgotten crops, let's use the word traditional crops now, add a lot of value, not just nutritional value, but there's a lot of cultural value, there's the economic value that they add, but also I think another very important point that they add to the state is in terms of biodiversity. Right, in terms of plant biodiversity, in terms of agrobiodiversity, traditional crops play a very important role. So let's start with Komilari there. Give us a little sense of what these traditional crops bring to the state in terms of maintaining and conserving the state's agrobiodiversity.
Meghalaya is part of the biodiversity hotspot, right? As our other neighboring states as well. So and the plant diversity, which is the agrobiodiversity, the edible plants, is also very high. In fact, we had done a study in different communities in Janta Hills, Ribhoi, even Garo Hills, and we found that the edible plant diversity is still very high. In fact, all the villages had more than 200 plant, edibles that could be eaten, and this was done a very participative way where people actually came together to actually list down what they know of the plants that are around them in their own villages. So it just shows that there is a lot of plant diversity, which actually is part of the agrobiodiversity and adds to our nutrition and what we've been talking about. But at the same time, of course, there are threats to this, because the threats is at the knowledge level. People are beginning to lose this knowledge. It's only those who are much elderly, that knowledge stays with them. And as you know, our communities are oral, right? So most of that knowledge is also with the elderly community. So that is so one level of loss is there. The other is the degradation of forest. Most of our food systems are based on the natural environment, right? So if our forests are degrading, that also reduces the plant diversity, the agrobiodiversity, and of course, degradation of forests. We know there are multiple sources of degradation, from mining to, forest, just cutting off the hills with, a lot of development work that's happening now. Nobody seems to care if, the mud just flows through, the ravines, and nobody cares whether that is part of, an important forest for a close community.
Off a few species.
Yes, you've wiped off also, you don't know, because what I think with the work of NESFAS and what we've done so far is that we always see that there are many varieties to one plant, So for example, we look at taro also, there's several varieties. So we wouldn't even know if some of them disappear, and maybe be called forgotten food also, some varieties of it. So I think those are the things that, we have the resources, and it is not too late if we have to do something about it also. Yeah.
So now you mentioned knowledge system there.
Yes.
And Congress has been hammering on knowledge systems for a while now, so I cannot ignore that anymore. What is being done, or what should be done to preserve these knowledge systems so that we don't lose out on what these traditional crops bring to us, to the not just to the economy, to our food systems, to everything that make us a people. What has been done so far, and do you think what should be done? I think Congress, you should answer this in terms of documenting these knowledge systems.
So just like Kong Malari had said, the mapping exercise, that we done is the way of identifying the food plants that are there with the communities. And it's time for us to acknowledge the wisdom holders, and whom we call the custodian farmers, who still hold the knowledge about this rich biodiversity, the uses, the importance of these biodiversity. And then what we have done also is, like, currently in NESFAS we are working for the people's biodiversity registers, which is very important because it's a documentation that will be with the communities to know that whatever resources that they have are in their their ownership of all those biodiversity. And the second thing, like what I said about the knowledge, it has to be both. It has to be in horizontal as well as vertical. It should be like a bottom-up approach now. What we have in NESFAS, we have the Agrobiodiversity Walk, which is like a tool which has become very effective among the youth, especially, and the children, where we take the knowledge holders as the teacher, who takes the children to the different production system and give them the knowledge of what these plants are. So in a way, it gives them a pride to, about the food plants that they have. Then the second thing would be in terms of the scientific community, because what we did was, when we were making after the mapping of the agrobiodiversity, we came up with an ABD book. So when there, we also try to provide the nutritional and content of each of the food plants, and we saw that a lot of our food plants did not have those studies being done on them. So I think it's time that the scientific community also acknowledge that there is this rich knowledge in terms of the nutrients of our food plants. And on the larger level, I think we need a policy change which would involve the inclusion of these local food plants in say, programs related to midday meals, or programs related to a public distribution system. Right. So, for example, if we are talking about millet for so far, if you look at the Saura region, previously millet was the main staple, but now you see we eat rice from morning, day, and even night. This never used to be a staple. So one thing is like the introduction of those staple grains have also caused into a neglect of some of the food plants that we have.
That we've traditionally had.
Yeah.
So I think Congresha then mentioned something about midday meal on your behalf, I believe on behalf of the Indigenicity Republic Health. There is some effort being made, right, to incorporate some of these traditional crops into the special nutrition program of ICDS. So is this an ongoing thing? Maybe you could say something about that.
Yes, we are currently we're working with the St. John's Research Institute in Bangalore, which is funded by the WHO. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to document the supplementary nutrition program across the 8 states in the Northeast India. And we're trying to see how we can optimize the supplementary nutrition in terms of, if, like for example, if it's a khichdi, right? So usually what we found is that this, a few weeks back we found that rice is given with rice is cooked with dal, is cooked with the soya, the Nutrella, basically, the soya chunks. So we will have to, what we are trying to do is that we are trying to see if that amount of food that is going to be given, what is the nutrition that is given to a child. Let's say we see it is a very high protein kind of diet, right? Because soya is also a very high protein, dal, and then there are carbs with rice and all that. Right. So how can we improve better from there, and include more of the local food also, so that it has the other micronutrients as well. So that is what we are trying to do, of course, at the institute level. Of course, it's a research, and it is still ongoing. We don't have definite results as of now. Yes.
But it's fair to say that there is some work, some effort being made.
Yes, definitely.
At institutional level, at policy level.
Yes.
That this concept of recognizing these traditional crops is there, and steps are being taken towards that. We'll have to wrap up very soon, but just one or two more questions before we end. Again, I think we have to discuss two very important aspects of these traditional crops. One is, of course, what they bring in terms of food security for the rural communities, right? And this is effort. All of these, of course, contribute towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, towards the right to food, right against hunger. So briefly, Congresha, you've seen in what they can do to food security, how they can add to the food security of rural communities. You work there in the field. Tell us something about that, of what they bring to the food security of the farmers themselves. We're not even talking about them selling these crops in the market, but what it brings to the families there in rural communities.
Okay. So the strength of our indigenous food system lies in its diversity. So if there is also suppose a particular crop being lost, they still have something else to depend upon. So that is the diversity aspect, and we also know that the local communities are known to have the knowledge about the foraging. So oftentimes, if we look at citing again example during the COVID-19, we saw that most of our communities, when we did a study on 18 communities, we saw that we did not face severe food insecurity because of the diversity that supported them. The other aspect in terms of this is that the diversity in itself, when we talk about climate resilient, because the local food plants are adapted to the local environment. Right. And that makes it much more resilient in terms of any disaster or anything. That's so to say. We hope so. And the other thing that I would like to also state in terms of the, we're talking a lot about carbon sequestration in terms of climate change and all, and the plant diversity that we have. Say that there has been a very wrong connotation about shifting cultivation being bad. Exactly. But what we saw is that the practice that we do is we leave a fallow, and that as the new young shoots come in, the carbon absorption is regeneration. Yeah. So these aspects, if we look, strengthened our so to say that if you remember in the last UN summit on the food system, the indigenous food system was recognized as a game-changing solution towards the climate change, towards meeting the SDG goals. So it's high time, as I say, that we need to bring the indigenous people into the table of discussion.
Correct. So 2 birds with 1 stone there, because I was going to touch on climate resilience, but you've already touched upon that. So I think we just have one more question there before we go. Very briefly, Pomelani, there are, of course, threats. You mentioned that these traditional food systems meet, on an everyday basis. What can be done briefly, at that policy level, at community level, at the level of academia, where you're from? What do you think are the few things that can be done to preserve and to promote indigenous food systems?
I think the first thing that we need to do is recognizing. I mean, as a state government, because recently the Niti Aayog has actually recognized jhum cultivation, to be actually, the game-changing solution. Has recognized its importance and how what has been said all along that shifting cultivation is bad is actually not so. So therefore, I think at the state level, like for example, a policy document of Niti Aayog needs to actually percolate to the state level. So at the state level, we need to recognize that. For example, it could be the agriculture department, could be the horticulture department, who recognizes that, traditional food will improve, the economy, will actually help farmers, will actually have multiple, positive benefits. The second is, when we've recognized that, then they would also include traditional food into the programs of the government. Otherwise, these have never been included. Recently, before the UN summit, there was a very rapid actually survey that was done among farmers in all the northeastern states, on their perspectives of actually traditional food. And one of the things they said is that when we go for and cultivate traditional food, there's never been any incentives from the government. In fact, there's always been that, please plant this new variety of so and so, rather than actually encouraging planting those indigenous varieties, which Gracia has already mentioned, which are climate resilient, which we, are nutritious, and so on and so forth. So I think that is very important. To recognize that. Recognition is so important. Recognition, I'm just saying that it will be like a policy document on the shelves, but actually having actionable points, actionable initiatives at the ground level, supporting the work of organizations like NESFAS, like the Society for Rural and Urban Empowerment. These are organizations working in the field. And also, if there are some work that has been done by academia, by institution, recognize that, because a lot of we say that the scientific community is forgotten. There's so many scientific papers on these. It is just on the shelf somewhere in some journal. Nobody uses it, right? So I think that general awareness of the public also needs to be there, because we are too much on the market economy. We always, go and buy our food. We always think of, even in the rural areas, actually that is actually changing, that they look only to the market. You have the money, they feel that food security can be attained only by, when you have the money. If you're poor, you cannot attain. But I think I beg to differ, because if we look into our communities, they can achieve food security or even nutritional security, even with lesser amount of money in their hands, if they use the food resources that they have around them. So I think there's a lot of mindset change that I continue talking about whenever I get a chance to talk about the mindset change that needs to be.
Growing your own food is a very, very noble thing to do. That's what our ancestors have done. So maybe we've forgotten that, and maybe that's what we need to do. That's what I think you're trying to say.
Yeah.
So, finally, of course, NESFAS has done a lot of work on these traditional crops, on indigenous food systems. The way ahead, briefly in one or two sentences, what should be done?
So the way ahead would be, the first thing would be, as I've always said, is on awareness creation and working with grassroots communities and also institutions, like we're working with MLCU and other institutions, and we have international partners who are supporting us into building this evidences on our food system. And also we hope that Melody have specifically mentioned the behavioral change. So that would be a movement that we as a community, we as indigenous people will have to take forward.
All right, so briefly, that is what this discussion is all about. It's about the forgotten crops of Meghalaya, which have turned to traditional crops of Meghalaya. Of course, we've expanded that into indigenous food systems. So if there's anything that you can take from this discussion, is go out, buy your Jali, buy your Jarain, buy your Jamardo, buy your yam. So don't forget all the traditional food that our ancestors have grown and survived with. That's been the purpose of this discussion. I hope it's been of some use to all of you. So thank you very much for joining us in this discussion.